Okay, we're going to open up for questions and comments now, and so I'm going to open up the floor. Yvonne.
I'm Yvonne Cook Riley. In the movie Milk, we saw that the gay movement in San Francisco did not really happen until the incident in Florida with Anita Bryant. Now, are you taking and making Zucker and them our Anita Bryant as our catalyst? Or are we taking the American Psychiatric Association as a body and making them the catalyst? Because it really comes down to, if we don't have a we and they situation, we cannot measure, are we succeeding or are we just backpedaling and staying the same? We know after 20 years of battling this group that if we do nothing, that we will all be future people that will have to be registered as sex offenders. That's where it's going. And we will have to go to the police department and say that we can't move and live someplace within 1,000 feet of a park or within 2,000 feet of a school because we are sex deviants and sex offenders only because we are transgender. That is the worst case scenario, but it could happen based upon what they're telling to us. And it scares the hell out of me. That's me.
Well, I definitely, whether it's Zucker or the APA, I hope it can be one of the things that contributes to this tipping point. And I think that, you know, I saw Milk too and was very inspired by it. And I loved the street level activism, their militant resolve, and also reading Kelley's book about the history of how gay activists work to get homosexuality delisted. I think we need a return to at least some of that street level activism. Obviously more than that. It's got to be a multi-pronged approach. But you know, I want to be at that conference too, because I think it really is important to be there. It's important for trans people and our allies to be there, be visible, and show that we care about this issue and we care about really making a difference. Yeah.
To answer, Yvonne, I'm Dr. Dana Beyer. George Bush is gone, except on Broadway, where he's being played by Will Ferrell now. I think we can take great hope in that we will not be labeled sex offenders. I also think this group is an example of what's happening. Michael Bailey's publication of The Man Who Would Be Queen in 2003 created the circumstances that led to this. It activated Lynn and Andrea and Calpurnia and a whole bunch of us, including those of us who were fortunate enough to be in the Vagina Monologues 5 years ago, to be part of this growing movement. We're all here today because of that. That was only 6 years ago. But it's happened. This is what it is. We don't have to march on Washington. We're doing lots of things. We're standing up to them.
So I'd like to weigh in on that a little bit, because even though, you know, this morning I walked the mall, I stood by the Washington Monument, I looked down at the White House, I thought about who lives there, and I've never felt prouder to be an American. But we've seen political movements and political attitudes shift with the tides over the years. And we're talking about diagnostic policies that can span 5 presidential terms with one major revision. And so I think, you know, I think the concern that Yvonne has raised, and we've actually seen that. I mean, not on a broad national sense, but we have certainly seen that anecdotally, and we've seen that in localities. How many people in this room who have transitioned have been asked the question, have you ever been diagnosed with a mental illness on a job application? And struggled with that. And that's real, and that's very current. Yes.
I want to thank you all 3 of you, for an incredibly interesting and informative presentation. I also want to say that as an aspiring sexologist, I'm in a Ph.D. program to finish up being for clinical sexology, I'd never heard the term cissexual, so I thought you said sick, sexual, like there's these people are sexually sick. So that term means, and basically it would be like sort of gay and straight. I mean, in other words, people who are not transgendered in some way are cissexual, is that right?
Well, a cissexual is kind of like the opposite to transsexual. So the term that's actually used a lot more frequently is transgender. Cisgender, which is people who are not transgender are cisgender. And it's just basically based on cis, the prefix means on the same side, and trans means on the other side. So if we're transgender or transsexual because we kind of cross gender, then people who always stay on one side of their cis.
Well, thank you. And just the last thing is, in my PhD program some years ago, Dr. Granzik, who's the head of the program, was bringing up also his chagrin about the whole disordered, thing. But he brought up one point. He's consulted a lot for people who, want to have a sex reassignment surgery. They often go to him. He's considered kind of an expert, and so that's one of the things. And he was saying that he was concerned if it got, let's say this category got taken completely out of the DSM, what he was concerned about is some companies will pay for SRS and so forth. So if it doesn't appear anywhere as a problem, let's say, how could people be reimbursed for the surgery? And I guess your idea about putting it in some more of a medical way that doesn't make it so pejorative, but I guess it needs to be somewhere if an insurance company is going to pay for
No,
it.
that's a very good point. First, I do not take credit for the idea of moving into medical nomenclature. And although I totally support those efforts, and a lot of my close friends are involved in those efforts, my personal efforts have been more on harm reduction, saying
Right.
as long as we're in the DSM, and there is no medical replacement.
Right.
And at the outset, and I want to make this clear because I've been misquoted so badly in the Advocate and in other places, and many of us are, because divisions within the trans community are often sensationalized in the straight press and in the gay press. And in the Advocate article last year, literally my direct quotes were cut in half to change their meaning. And that's kind of not the first time that kind of thing happens. So we do have to really watch clarity and message consistency from our trans perspective and how we're represented in a GLBT context. But again, my personal values are that there are not one but two concurrent issues, and that both politically and ethically, I feel that we must address them both, and that is medical access, of medical necessity, and medical access for the subset of our community that needs that.
Right.
And as you pointed out, what we have today is tenuous. What we have today is not great, but we certainly don't want to throw under the bus those gender dysphoric transsexual people who are where that is all we have for access. So like I said, we need some kind of diagnostic nomenclature that clearly supports access to transition procedures, which is not what we have today. Our supportive mental health care providers who are in a gatekeeping role are forced to take this reparative therapy diagnosis, this gender reparative therapy diagnosis that we have today, and kind of twist it into being a transition supportive diagnosis, and bless their hearts for doing that. But I think there are things that we can do to make the current diagnostic nomenclature suck less than it does today, while we're exploring new ideas for non-psychiatric alternative nomenclature. I don't know who is next.
Thank you.
Just to follow up on that, the coding Bible, not the Psych Bible, the coding Bible that every physician lives with in order to get reimbursed, the ICD-9 in the US, has transsexualism as a diagnosis.
Oh.
You can use that, which is also not to say that many private insurers will reimburse you for anything these days, but.
However, I must point out, though, that in the ICD, transsexualism is not a physical medical diagnosis. It is in the section of psychiatric diagnosis, and it's based on the DSM.
Right.
So it's not fixed either. Just yours.
Okay. Hi.
I'm sorry.
Mary Ann Arno from here in Maryland. It's really interesting when Yvonne stood up and said what she said, just from my notes of hearing all three of you, and specifically this list of 10 that you had assembled, my mind automatically went to, and I will literally share with you what I wrote. It seems as though this is the systematic building of a clinical legend in order to completely to continue demonize, eventually discredit, and possibly even criminalize us in the future, which is essentially exactly what she said. And that's what I read out of it. And the term that I used was narrowing the eye of the needle. If the eye of the needle is clinically being narrowed, the further along we go, based on the observations that you've made and based on the discredit and the continuing discreditation amongst in academia, how do we gather enough opposing force and information to defy that, oppose it, discredit them? How is there a way to, as you put it, for yourself, where you're obviously you're much happier, much more well-adjusted, probably much more successful in every aspect of your life now, this far along at this point in your life, than clinically speaking, even though clinically speaking now at this point, you would actually be considered less well off based on the very standards that we're talking about. How do we amass enough information from enough people to clearly quantify that, to show that this is in fact completely errant, inaccurate, and that cannot possibly be clinically used as an accurate standard? How do we do that?
That's a tough one. That's a great question. I mean, I think a couple of things that came to mind was, coming to conferences like this is, Yvonne called it a working conference. We're coming up with strategies together to help confront these problems. I also talked in here about how important it is for us to be out and visible as who we are in our communities, because the J. Michael Baileys of the world continue to want to show us as these shadow underworld people who are deviant, criminal, way out there on the extreme. And we are so much more diverse than that limited stereotype. And I really believe that the full spectrum and breadth of our diversity still has not been seen by most people in the society. One of the things that helped the gay and lesbian movement so much...
We all know that, but if the powers that exist within the medical community and the insurance community, which just financially speaking outweigh the resources of all of us 10 or 100 to 1, if they've already consolidated, and as you said, the process is now less transparent than it ever is, and that in itself is frightening. The consolidation of power through the CAMH organization overseeing, they're not even an American organization, but yet they're overseeing the dissemination of the American Psychiatric Association's statistical clinical data manuals. I mean, how do we get around behind that? I mean, is there actually a suspicion that there are possibly government and even far-reaching right-wing conservative connections in organizations like this? And since they realize that socially speaking, they're about to take a real big hit, the more of us that come and do exactly what we're doing, what you're saying, being visible, being open, being professional, being articulate, being all the things that we need to be to help society get over itself and get past its stereotypical misperceptions. So the next step is, well, they've already got 10 or 15 or 20 or 30 years of legend built. Anybody in their right mind who's opposed on the conservative religious side or any other opposing side would obviously want to consolidate their power and their support behind any institution that is continuing to build a clinical legend that will eventually redefine and completely discredit ourselves and our journey.
So, can I speak to that? And this is something that Joelle's piece spoke to, which is that I think, when the fact that Zucker is the overall chairperson for this section, and that Ray Blanchard was put in charge of the paraphilia section, which to me scares me. Like the amount of damage that could be done with gender identity disorder is bad, but I'm way more, I feel way more personally threatened by the idea of autogynephilia being codified as a diagnosis in the DSM. I think that would be the worst possible thing that could happen, out of all of this. I mean, at least that's where I'm coming from. And so while all that's going on, and while it sounds as bad as it could possibly be for the DSM-5 coming up, what we have on our side, and this is what Joelle alluded to, is that everything else has been going in our favor. You know, in 1994, whenever the DSM-4 was first written, like, trans people were not very out. Basically, we didn't have a community voice at the level that we do now. And right now, we're at a point where we have a lot of potential allies. And in the worst case scenario that the DSM-5 ends up being as horrible as we fear that it could be, you know, we have people who are either, like, we're allies with the greater LGBT community. One of the things that I try to do in my piece, especially in talking about autogynephilia and linking it to sexism, is that I think that there are a lot of allies within the APA who know nothing about transsexuality per se, but if they were exposed to how sexist and how heterosexist a lot of these diagnoses are, they would be appalled, right? And so there are ways that even if really bad diagnoses were put forward, they have to be approved by the general body, right? So I think that there are lots of places where we could intervene politically, either through our allies within the organization.
With enough opposing and accurate information, such as just the illustration of your story. These 10 points here are literally only a starting point in terms of how many of us actually defy every single clinical and cultural stereotype that people have tried to apply to us, and how do we mass that kind of information into a format that is going to be impactful wherever it goes? Is there an idea, a way to think about centralizing something like that, to start gathering stories, to start what you did, this list? Well, if everybody in here came up with 10 more reasons why these are inaccurate based on our own personal experiences, and then you go around the country and you come up with a couple hundred or a couple thousand more, and you get people that are willing to talk about that, write about it, be interviewed by it, be tested by every standard by it that exists, and throw this garbage the hell out of the window.
Well, there are academic papers like Kelley, who is one of the authors of them, that are in the academic, you know, psychological literature that basically address all of these issues. The thing is that, and there are lots of people within psychology who feel that the way the diagnoses are written now, or that the theory of autogynephilia are really problematic and potentially dangerous. It's just that those people weren't appointed to chair the sections, right? And I think that what we have on our side as trans people, as a community, is that they know that we have a voice now, and they know that if they like decided to just write it the way that they want it, like our worst case scenario, that there would be a backlash that would be so big that it would make what happened in 1973 in the APA with homosexuality look like you know, a cakewalk.
Yeah,
I mean,
can I have a comment?
sounds like they're
No, I
already
just want to say,
consolidating their power.
we're not powerless here. And what we've seen, you have to, and look at it historically for a moment. Before, people could, in the psychiatric world, the psychological world, could step up and say anything they wanted to about us, and no one would really push back on that. There would be not a sound. We were diffuse, we were not connected, we were not interconnected. We weren't networked together, we didn't have websites where we could focus. Time has passed, and we've learned a lot of things. And not only that, but a lot of us have moved into professional positions and have broken down the barriers. Like before, when Avigdor was only a psychological group, it's now made up of plenty of people who are actually transsexual. And we don't just lay down and let them chatter away. We step up and say, no, hold on. We do push back on ideas that are not consistent with our experience. We also go through academia and we get criticized, but when we do, we step up and we say, through websites, Lynn's site in particular, Andrea's website, there's a lot of internet connection where people can now talk to each other and come out in outrage and say, no, we can't have Michael Bailey saying that without some major pushback, and completely in the media, and attack him academically, because he cloaks himself in academia. It's fair to attack his academic standing. And without any power, with being spread out throughout, not being able to talk to each other, we were easily victimized, easily sexualized. as we go on, the tipping point, it's like we're at the tipping point. We are at the point where we can come together, where we can forge ideas on how to show that we're not just powerless, and we're not willing to just lay down and be criminalized. When we have cases that are being pushed forward in the court systems that says you can't discriminate against us, and it's being supported through the court system, all that's coming together saying, no, we can't go back to the ideas that are proposed by, or were completely presented by Bailey, Blanchard, Zucker. And I want to point out, there are ideas that when we stand up and say, no, not here, there are people who point to us and say, that's just an emanation of your problem. Because you raised your voice so loudly and got angry with us, you're obviously pathologized.
Right, you're obviously injured because of the fact that we were right and this is just your
Well, your
reaction
rage,
to it.
your rage that you've already presented here.
Narcissistic rage.
Thank you.
Yeah.
It's a result of this condition.
Did you know that my book is a primal scream of narcissistic rage?
So,
Damn right it is.
That book is exactly what we need to do. That book says, here's how things happen, and here's a perspective on it that's our voice, and why it's craziness to present something like the GID. Instead of presenting us as crazy, we're holding up a mirror and saying, look, this isn't the way it is. Are there no sex workers? Of course there are some sex workers. Are there no people who do all the things that they paint as stereotypes? Perhaps.
That's me.
Perhaps. But don't point to the stereotypes and
Inverted, it's
say,
all true.
that's who we are. We get to define ourselves. And we do it through every tool that we have available to us today, including standing up and presenting ourselves as normal or whatever. You know,
Lisa?
just what we
Yeah.
are.
Can we
Lisa,
have one
by
more
this-
comment and then we'll call it a day?
I just have a quick follow-up
Yes.
to that, because you had some good answers to your own question. We need to be out there with our own stories and our own narratives that defy these stereotypes as a community. And another thing that's not happening is that there is a silent majority of affirming, supportive mental health caregivers who are not speaking up. They are terrified to speak up.
I'm Maureen Osborne. I've been a psychologist and a member of APA for 25 years, and I, got frustrated with them a long time ago. But if they're the ones that are setting the standards, if it's the Zuckers, and I don't know if any of you have seen or talked with him, but he's a formidable person. And I think the reason that he has the power that he has is that he churns out research and research and research, and that's the language that people in the APA really believe and accept. You know, he's got this research. The reason I gave up APA a long time ago is because I realized that you could make your research say anything you wanted to make it say, and you know, but if you can, you know, do research, and I have no stomach for research, but we really, really do need research.
But even relating clinical experience and clinical judgment.
Well,
There are
we do
armies
that.
and
Yes,
armies.
yes.
And we need those viewpoints out and vocal and on the
And my impression is that the vast majority, certainly in a big, but even in the psychological community, is much more sympathetic to transgender people than Zucker. Zucker is a real minority opinion within a big WPATH.
Yeah. I think one more thing that I just want to throw in there is that I know that there are other segments of the world that feel just as fearful about the DSM that might come out next, that have nothing to do with like gender or sexuality, right?
Right.
There are lots of people who are really afraid that they're being completely cloaked in silence, right? There are a lot of people who are worried that there are going to be all these extra diagnoses added, right? And I think that there's a great potential for alliance, right? That in the event that there's so much like these new diagnoses that are out there, if a lot of different groups can band together, right, there's a potential to just like chuck the whole thing. Like there's no absolute positive reason why the APA has to be like the Bible, except that it's kind of a given that that's the Bible. If you had enough people say that doesn't count anymore, you know, if there's a different organization like the other APA, the good APA. like, you know, I'm just putting it out there, right? I think that's something that we haven't really like talked a lot about, but it's going to take a while from them to get to the point now where they're writing the diagnoses in secret to it being passed and it being like out the door. And I think that there's a lot of different ways we can intervene in there. So, and we need all the allies we can get, even if it's allies outside of the transgender community and advocacy.
Okay, I want to thank everyone for coming and sticking with us through this very long panel. And I think these discussions continue during the day tomorrow during the sessions, and also Kelley's going to be giving a talk tomorrow at lunch, is that right?
That's correct.
Continuing about the GID, so it's really on the agenda of this conference, which I think is so important, and we're thankful to IFGE for that. And thanks again, and enjoy your evening.